Eastern Russia is one of the most mysterious regions on Earth. Stretching from the Ural Mountains all the way to the Pacific Ocean, it covers more than 6 million square kilometers, an area so vast that if Eastern Russia were a country of its own, it would be the largest on the planet. Larger than Canada, larger than the United States, larger than the entire European Union combined. And yet, for all this size, it remains astonishingly empty. Only about 7 million people live here. That is less than the population of New York City spread across a landmass greater than the size of an entire continent. This emptiness is not just unusual. It is one of the great geographical puzzles of the modern world. Because, in theory, this part of Russia should be thriving. It has incredible natural resources: oil, gas, coal, timber, diamonds, and gold. It has access to both the Arctic and the Pacific Oceans. It has rivers, forests, and fertile valleys. And yet, despite all of this, the people are gone. Entire towns have been abandoned. Factories are left rusting in the snow. The wilderness has swallowed once bustling settlements, leaving behind nothing but broken windows and crumbling walls. When people outside Russia hear about this emptiness, they usually give a simple answer: the cold. And certainly, winters in Siberia and the Russian Far East are brutal. Temperatures plunge below -50°C. Snow buries houses, rivers freeze solid, and survival itself becomes a daily struggle. But cold alone cannot explain this paradox. After all, Canada, Alaska, and Scandinavia face similar conditions, and yet, people live there in large numbers. If those regions can survive the cold, why can't Russia's Far East? The answer is far more complicated. And far more revealing. Because the emptiness of Eastern Russia is not just a story about climate. It is a story about geography, economics, history, and strategy. A story that stretches back centuries, through Tsarist exiles, Soviet gulags, and modern geopolitical rivalries. And it is a story that could shape the future of Russia itself. Let us begin with the myth of the cold. It is true, the far east of Russia experiences some of the harshest winters on Earth. In the town of Oymyakon, often called the coldest inhabited place in the world, the temperature once dropped to -71°C. In Yakutsk, the regional capital, people cannot leave their homes without layers of fur and felt boots that protect them from frostbite. Cars are left running all night because if the engines turn off, the cold will freeze them solid. Roads are coated in ice for months at a time. Even breathing feels painful in the sharp, dry air. But here's the important question: if cold is enough to explain emptiness, why do other cold regions not remain empty? Take Alaska, for example. Its winters are bitter, with temperatures falling below -40°. Yet Anchorage is home to nearly 300,000 people, and the state overall is thriving with oil, fisheries, and tourism. Or consider Canada's Northern Territories. Yellowknife, with only 20,000 residents, endures winters nearly as harsh as Siberia, yet life goes on, supported by mining industries, government subsidies, and infrastructure that connects it to the rest of the country. Norway provides another example. The town of Tromsø lies far above the Arctic Circle, where winter nights last for weeks. Yet Tromsø is not abandoned. It has a university, a hospital, and even an international airport. It attracts tourists who come to see the northern lights. The cold has not driven people away; in fact, it has become part of the identity of the place, something to be managed rather than feared. So what is different about Eastern Russia? The climate is not uniquely impossible. The difference lies in what surrounds the cold. In Alaska, in Canada, in Norway, governments invested in infrastructure, in industries, in connections that made life sustainable. But in Eastern Russia, cold combined with isolation creates a far greater challenge. Without connections, without industries, without a steady flow of goods and services, the cold becomes more than an inconvenience, it becomes a trap. This is why the idea that Siberia is empty because it is cold is a myth. Cold is only the beginning of the story. To understand the real reason for emptiness, we have to look at the geography. The sheer distances. The isolation. The wilderness that separates eastern Russia not only from the rest of the world, but from Russia itself. If cold alone cannot explain the emptiness of eastern Russia, then geography must. Because while climate is harsh, what truly defines this land is distance. Endless, crushing distance. From Moscow to Vladivostok, the journey is nearly 9,300 kilometers by rail. That is like traveling from New York City all the way to Los Angeles, and then back again, and then halfway across the continent once more. It is the longest continuous train route in the world, the legendary Trans-Siberian Railway. But even this monumental achievement, completed more than a century ago, cannot bridge the vastness of the land. The railway connects only certain cities. Between them, hundreds of kilometers stretch across forests, swamps, and tundra with nothing in between. For most of eastern Russia, the railway might as well not exist. Consider the rivers. In Europe and North America, rivers became lifelines of trade, acting as natural highways that connected cities. The Mississippi, the Rhine, the Danube, they made development possible. But in Siberia and the Russian Far East, rivers are a curse as much as a blessing. They are long and mighty, but for much of the year they are frozen solid. Barges cannot pass, trade cannot flow, and people are cut off. Even when they thaw, flooding can wash away villages and roads, reminding everyone that nature rules here, not man. Roads are another problem. Paved highways are rare outside the major cities, and many dirt roads vanish under snow in winter or become mud pits in spring. Maintaining roads across thousands of kilometers of permafrost is a nightmare. Asphalt cracks and buckles, bridges collapse under the strain of shifting ice, and entire stretches disappear each year. What takes hours in other countries can take days here, if the journey is even possible at all. Geography also creates isolation at the human level. Imagine living in a town where the nearest major settlement is not a short drive away, not even half a day away, but several days of dangerous travel. In many villages, helicopters are the only reliable way to reach the outside world. Small planes serve as lifelines for food, medicine, and mail. But these flights are expensive, irregular, and often cancelled due to weather. The sense of being cut off is constant, and it wears on the spirit of those who live here. Compare this to other cold regions. In Alaska, Anchorage is connected to the rest of the United States by highways, shipping routes, and air travel. In Canada, even the northern territories are linked to southern provinces by reliable infrastructure. But in eastern Russia, connections are fragile, temporary, and always at the mercy of the elements. This isolation magnifies the effects of the cold, turning inconvenience into disaster, and difficulty into impossibility. Geography does not just limit physical movement, it limits imagination. For centuries, the Far East has felt like the edge of the known world, distant from Moscow, distant from Europe, distant from everything that Russians traditionally considered the center of civilization. And in many ways, it still does. The distances are not just kilometers, they are psychological barriers. To move east feels like moving away from opportunity, away from the heart of the country, into a land where nothing is certain and everything is far. This is the geography of emptiness. Not just cold, but isolation. Not just distance, but crushing disconnection. And this geography sets the stage for the next part of the story, the economics of survival, and why, even with all its resources, eastern Russia remains a land where prosperity is fleeting and emptiness always returns. On paper, eastern Russia should be one of the wealthiest regions on the planet. It is overflowing with resources. Beneath its frozen ground lie enormous reserves of oil, natural gas, coal, gold, and diamonds. Forests stretch farther than the eye can see, filled with timber that could supply industries for centuries. Rivers and seas hold fish, minerals, and potential shipping routes. To any outsider, this should look like a land of limitless opportunity. But in reality, this abundance is a trap. Extracting resources in eastern Russia is among the most expensive operations on Earth. The first challenge is distance. Mines and oil fields often lie thousands of kilometers from the nearest port, refinery, or industrial center. Transporting equipment to build them requires railroads, pipelines, and roads that don't exist, and when they do, they crumble under the stress of permafrost. Every kilometer of infrastructure costs billions, and every year it has to be repaired or rebuilt. The second challenge is labor. Who wants to live in these conditions? To attract workers, companies have to offer extremely high wages, housing, and benefits. During the Soviet era, this was achieved through central planning. Entire cities were built almost overnight, designed around a single factory or mine. Workers were relocated by the state, given subsidized apartments, schools, and healthcare. For a time, these company towns seemed to thrive. But they were fragile. When global markets shifted, when the Soviet Union collapsed, or when the cost of keeping them alive grew too high, they were abandoned. Today, dozens of ghost towns remain scattered across the Russian Far East. Empty apartment blocks with broken windows. Rusting machinery left behind in the snow. Schools without children, hospitals without patients. In places like Magadan or Chukotka, entire communities have vanished, leaving behind eerie reminders of dreams that never lasted. Maintaining utilities for shrinking populations, heating, water, electricity, costs more than governments or companies can afford. And so, one by one, these towns are left to die. Even the cities that survive are under constant pressure. Vladivostok, the largest port in the region, is more connected to China, Korea, and Japan than to Moscow. Supplies are expensive, housing is costly, and young people often leave for opportunities in the West. Yakutsk, famous as the coldest major city in the world, struggles every year to keep infrastructure intact. Pipes burst, power grids collapse, and food prices soar because everything must be flown in or hauled across vast distances. The third challenge is corruption and inefficiency. Large state-owned companies dominate the resource industries. Profits often flow not to the region itself, but back to Moscow, leaving local communities with little benefit. Promised investments vanish into bureaucracy or are lost to mismanagement. For residents, the result is frustration. They live in one of the richest regions on paper, but their standard of living remains low. This economic trap has a direct effect on population. Young people see no future in the Far East. They move west, to Moscow, St. Petersburg, or abroad. Birth rates fall, death rates rise, and villages shrink. In some areas, the population has declined by more than 50% since the collapse of the Soviet Union. Entire generations are leaving, and very few are replacing them. When we look at the numbers, the emptiness becomes even more clear. Eastern Russia makes up roughly 36% of Russia's land area, yet it holds less than 5% of its people. That is not just imbalance, it is collapse. Imagine if the United States had only 15 million people living west of the Mississippi. Or if Canada's entire northern half had just a few scattered cities and the rest abandoned. That is the scale of emptiness we are talking about. The economic trap explains why Eastern Russia is not thriving today. But to fully understand why people actively avoid it, we need to look at the past. Because this land does not only carry the burden of geography and economics. It also carries the heavy shadow of history, of exile, punishment, and fear. To understand why people avoid Eastern Russia, we must look at history. Because this land is not just cold and distant, it is scarred. For centuries, the Russian Far East and Siberia were not lands of opportunity, but lands of punishment. They became the empire's dumping ground, a place where people were sent not to live, but to survive. It began under the Tsars. As early as the 17th century, criminals, rebels, and political dissidents were exiled to Siberia. The logic was simple: rather than overcrowding prisons in European Russia, the state would send its unwanted to the edge of the empire. The punishment was not only isolation from family and home, but the harshness of the land itself. Thousands of kilometers away, under unbearable cold, prisoners were forced to build villages, chop wood, and mine for resources. Many died, and those who survived were trapped, unable to return. The association between Siberia and exile grew stronger with each century. Decembrist revolutionaries, Polish rebels, writers who challenged the Tsar, all found themselves marched east, often on foot, across endless wilderness. Memoirs from these exiles describe hunger, disease, and despair. For generations of Russians, Siberia became a word filled with dread. Demographics also carry geopolitical consequences. Eastern Russia borders one of the most populous countries on Earth, China. On one side of the border, in Russia's far east, lie empty forests and deserted towns. On the other side, in China's Heilongjiang province, live more than 30 million people. The imbalance is striking. In the long term, it raises uncomfortable questions. What happens when a sparsely populated region rich in resources lies next to a densely populated nation hungry for them? The decline of population is not just a statistic. It is visible in the landscape. Empty apartment blocks in once proud mining towns. Silent factories where machines no longer hum. Abandoned schools, their chalkboards still covered with lessons from decades ago. The ghosts of communities that no longer exist. Each one tells the same story: without people, the land itself begins to fade. This demographic crisis is perhaps the most dangerous of all. Because while geography and economics can change with technology, while history can fade into memory, demographics are stubborn. Once people leave, they rarely return. Once birth rates fall, they take generations to recover. And once an entire region is seen as a place without a future, it is almost impossible to convince people otherwise. Eastern Russia is not just empty today. It risks becoming emptier tomorrow. Unless something changes dramatically, the story of decline will only continue. And this emptiness, far from being a weakness, is increasingly seen by Moscow as a kind of strength, a strategic buffer in a dangerous world. For most countries, emptiness is a weakness. It means less labor, less development, less defense. But for Russia, the emptiness of the Far East has increasingly been seen as a kind of strength, a shield against rivals, a buffer zone on the edge of Asia. Look at the map. To the south lies China, the world's most populous nation and Russia's uneasy partner. To the east lies Japan, an economic powerhouse and longtime rival. Across the Pacific sits the United States, Russia's greatest adversary for nearly a century. In geopolitical terms, Eastern Russia is the front line, the outer wall of the Russian state. If tens of millions of people lived here, defending them would be nearly impossible. Armies would need to be stationed along thousands of kilometers of border. Supply lines would stretch across frozen tundra and unpaved roads. Every city would become a potential target in case of war. Instead, emptiness provides flexibility. With few civilians in harm's way, the Russian military can treat the region as a fortress, moving forces where needed without worrying about evacuations or mass casualties. During the Cold War, this logic was clear. The Soviet Union built military bases across the Far East, positioned fleets in Vladivostok, and stationed nuclear weapons deep in Siberia. The region was not seen as a place for ordinary people to prosper, it was seen as a strategic shield, a vast space where enemies could be kept at a distance. Civilian life was secondary to military necessity. Even today, this mindset persists. In Moscow's eyes, the Far East does not need to be heavily populated. It only needs to be controlled. Pipelines carry oil and gas to Asia, but towns along the route remain small. Military bases remain supplied, but villages nearby continue to decline. The priority is not settlement, but sovereignty. As long as Russia maintains its grip on this territory, the emptiness itself serves as a deterrent. Of course, this strategy has risks. An empty land is also a tempting land. Just across the border, China holds over 1 billion people, many living in crowded cities with limited resources. The Russian Far East, by contrast, has land, water, timber, and energy, and almost no people to defend it. While Russia sees emptiness as protection, others may see it as opportunity. Japan, too, has lingering territorial disputes with Russia. The Kuril Islands remain contested, a reminder that eastern Russia's frontiers are not entirely secure. The United States, meanwhile, monitors the region closely, aware that Russia's Pacific ports provide critical access to global trade routes. For all its emptiness, the Far East is a chessboard where great powers measure each other's moves. This strategic emptiness helps explain why Moscow has never truly tried to reverse the decline. Subsidies are limited, investments are inconsistent, and migration policies rarely succeed. The Kremlin does not need millions of citizens living in the Far East. It only needs enough to maintain sovereignty, to man the bases, to keep the pipelines running. In that sense, emptiness is not a failure. It is a strategy. But strategies can change. And as Russia's population shrinks overall, as China's power continues to grow, the question becomes whether emptiness will remain an advantage, or whether it will turn into a liability. Eastern Russia has always been defined by paradoxes. A land rich in resources, yet poor in development. A territory vast and strategic, yet nearly empty of people. A frontier of survival rather than opportunity. But the greatest paradox may be this: its emptiness, once a shield, could become its greatest vulnerability in the decades ahead. The first factor shaping the future is China's rise. Just across the border, in the province of Heilongjiang, more than 30 million people live, nearly 5 times the population of the entire Russian Far East. Chinese cities bustle with industry, trade, and expansion. Fields produce food for millions, factories produce goods for the world. On the Russian side, villages shrink and towns fade. The contrast could not be sharper. And as China's hunger for resources grows, for oil, gas, timber, and farmland, the temptation of Eastern Russia may grow with it. Already, Chinese companies lease farmland in Siberia. Chinese traders dominate cross-border markets. Chinese workers fill gaps in construction and agriculture. For now, this is cooperation, sanctioned by Moscow. But it raises questions. If Russia cannot keep its own citizens in the Far East, can it prevent others from moving in? The second factor is climate change. Paradoxically, global warming may make Eastern Russia more habitable. Melting permafrost could open new land for farming. Retreating ice could open the Northern Sea route, turning Arctic waters into major shipping lanes connecting Asia to Europe. If that happens, towns along the Siberian coast could suddenly find themselves at the center of global trade. But climate change also brings danger. Melting permafrost destabilizes buildings and pipelines. Floods threaten riverside towns. Forest fires grow more destructive each year. Instead of prosperity, the region could face disaster. The third factor is Russia's internal decline. The country as a whole faces demographic collapse. Populations are shrinking, birth rates are falling, and the economy is stagnant. In this environment, Moscow may have fewer resources to invest in the Far East. Instead of revitalization, there may be further neglect. The Far East could become even more empty, even more abandoned, even more dependent on its role as a buffer rather than a community. Yet there is also the possibility of transformation. History shows that empty frontiers can sometimes become centers of growth. Alaska was once dismissed as Seward's Folly, a frozen wasteland. Today, it is an energy hub. Canada's northern territories, once ignored, now supply critical resources. Norway's Arctic towns thrive on tourism and energy development. If technology, investment, and global demand align, Eastern Russia could change. It could become not just a defensive wall for Moscow, but a gateway between Europe and Asia. The question is whether Russia has the will, or the capacity, to make that transformation happen. For now, the evidence suggests otherwise. Policies remain inconsistent. Migration continues westward. Ghost towns continue to spread. The stigma of exile and gulag still lingers in the national imagination. So what does the future hold? Most likely, more of the same. Emptiness will remain the defining feature of Eastern Russia. It will remain a land of paradox, rich but poor, vast but empty, strategic but fragile. And in that emptiness lies the future of Russia itself, whether it can hold this land, whether it can defend it, and whether it can finally turn its greatest weakness into strength. Eastern Russia remains one of the strangest contradictions on Earth. A region larger than continents, yet nearly empty. A land with unimaginable wealth, yet plagued by poverty and decline. A frontier of exile and punishment, yet a keystone of Russia's global strategy. We have seen how cold alone cannot explain the emptiness. We have seen how geography, the endless distances, the frozen rivers, the crumbling roads, isolates communities beyond endurance. We have seen how economics turn abundance into a trap, leaving ghost towns where factories once roared. We have seen how history, from Tsarist exile to Soviet gulags, stained the land with fear. And we have seen how demographics seal its fate, with young people fleeing and villages dying. And yet, despite all this, Eastern Russia endures. Its forests still whisper in the wind. Its rivers still carve their paths through ice. Its cities, though fragile, still hold on. The question is not whether this land will survive, it always has. The question is whether people will choose to remain, or whether emptiness itself will define the future. For now, the emptiness is both curse and strategy. A burden for those who live there, but a shield for those who rule from Moscow. It is a reminder that geography does not just shape nations, it defines them. And in the case of Russia, it may determine its future. But Eastern Russia is not the only place where emptiness hides secrets. Thousands of kilometers away, on the island of Taiwan, there lies another mystery, an entire coast deliberately left deserted. Why does Taiwan keep its eastern coast empty, facing the Pacific? And what does this reveal about one of the most dangerous geopolitical flashpoints in the world today? That is the story we'll uncover in the next video.